For 5 long years, my world revolved around one man, my husband, Martin. I gave up my job, my morning walks, even my group chats with old friends. Everything became about his medications, his doctor visits, his pain. At first, I didn't mind. I had promised, in sickness and in health, and I meant it. I believed love was supposed to be quiet and constant, like folding laundry or holding someone's hand when they're too weak to hold back. There were days I barely recognized myself. I used to be someone with plans, a voice, a sense of style. Somewhere along the way, I traded all of that for sweatpants and silence. Martin stopped saying thank you, but I told myself it wasn't his fault. Illness makes people retreat, right? I assumed the coldness in his eyes was exhaustion, not choice. I thought I understood what sacrifice meant. I didn't realize I was the only one making one. Looking back, there were signs I chose not to see. Phone calls he took behind closed doors. The way he flinched when I touched his shoulder. His birthday passed 1 year, and he barely looked up when I brought him cake. But I told myself, again, that this was pain, not distance. That if I just held on, he'd come back to me. I mistook his silence for suffering. I had no idea. It was guilt. People used to ask me how I did it. "You're so strong," they'd say. But strength wasn't a choice. It was the only option left. I'd smile politely, change the subject, and pretend I didn't hear the exhaustion in my own voice. I stopped talking about the nights I cried in the kitchen while reheating soup. I stopped explaining how lonely it is to share a bed with someone who barely acknowledges your presence. It's not that I wanted praise, I just wanted to feel like I mattered. There's a strange kind of erosion that happens when you're needed, but not seen. At some point, I became invisible, not just to Martin but to myself. My name stopped sounding like mine. I was just the wife, the caretaker, the one who made sure the refills were picked up and the sheets were clean. No one asked what I was reading or how I was sleeping. Honestly, I wasn't doing much of either. I just kept going. It's what I thought love demanded. But love, real love, it's not supposed to leave you feeling like a shadow. I told myself that over and over, whispering it like a prayer while scrubbing the same kitchen counter for the 3rd time in an hour. I convinced myself this season would pass, that one day Martin would turn to me, eyes soft again, and say, "Thank you for staying." I held on to that image like a lighthouse. All the while, the tide was already pulling me under. I used to replay our wedding vows in my mind, especially during the hardest days. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. I clung to those words like a lifeline. They gave purpose to the endless routine, the sorting of pills, the quiet dinners, the way I learned to decode the meaning behind a grunt or a sigh. I never thought to question whether Martin was holding up his end of the promise. I just assumed we were both weathering the same storm. But now, thinking back, I wonder if we were even in the same boat. While I was patching holes and steering through the fog, was he already swimming toward shore? There were moments, brief, fleeting ones, where I sensed something slipping. A look he gave me that felt more like obligation than affection. A comment he made that landed too hard. I ignored it. I told myself he was tired, that I was tired, that this was just part of marriage. I didn't know that while I was fighting for us, he was building a life I wasn't part of. I didn't know that every quiet dinner, every skipped birthday, every long, aching silence wasn't about pain. It was about guilt. A guilt so heavy he chose to bury it, and me, in silence. The day of Martin's funeral was overcast, like the sky couldn't decide if it wanted to cry or not. I stood by the casket, numb, surrounded by faces I barely registered. People said all the usual things. "He's in a better place. He was lucky to have you. You were so strong." I nodded, smiled, thanked them like I was supposed to. Inside, I felt nothing. Not grief, not peace. Just the strange, hollow ache of a chapter ending, and the quiet dread that maybe the next one would be worse. The will reading came sooner than I expected. I went alone, out of habit more than courage. I still thought of myself as his wife, his person, the one who would carry his wishes forward. I imagined maybe a note, something he left just for me. A thank you maybe, a goodbye. Instead, the lawyer spoke her name like it was nothing. Claudia. The house, the money, the investment accounts. All of it. To her. No hesitation. No explanation. Just her. I didn't understand at first. I blinked, waiting for someone to correct the mistake. But then the lawyer said the words I'll never forget. She was very close to him in the final years. That's when it clicked. The nights he told me to go ahead to bed. The trips he said were for treatment follow-ups. The sudden, inexplicable changes in his mood. Claudia wasn't a nurse or a friend. She was his mistress. And I was the afterthought. It's hard to describe the feeling of being erased while you're still standing in the room. My name wasn't even mentioned in the will. Not once. No keepsake, no letter, not even the courtesy of closure. Just a signature, neatly typed, gifting my entire life to another woman. I sat there frozen, heart pounding in my ears, wondering how someone I cared for so deeply could leave me so thoroughly behind. I wasn't just betrayed. I was discarded. The lawyer kept talking, but I stopped listening. My mind spiraled through 5 years of sacrifice, of brushing his hair back from his forehead, of holding his hand through test results, of sleepless nights beside machines that beeped and whirred. And the whole time, he was dreaming of a future with her. A future that didn't include me. The woman who watched him fade away piece by piece was not the woman he chose to remember. I didn't cry in that office. I didn't scream or collapse like in the movies. I just sat there blinking, clutching my coat like it was the only thing tethering me to the ground. I walked out with shaking legs, the lawyer's polite condolences trailing behind me like smoke. I wanted to feel angry, but all I felt was humiliated. Like I'd been the only one who didn't know I'd already been replaced. I went home that evening to a house that suddenly didn't feel like mine. Every room looked different. Every framed photo, every blanket I had folded 1,000 times. It all felt like evidence in a life I didn't recognize anymore. I stood in the kitchen, the one I used to clean obsessively for him, and wondered how many lies had been whispered in its silence. Was she here? Had her voice echoed off these same walls while I was out picking up his prescriptions? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea that went cold in my hands, trying to remember when exactly I stopped being his wife. Was it gradual, like sand slipping through fingers? Or was it sudden, a sharp turning point I missed while I was too busy holding everything together? I had poured years into a man who, in the end, left me nothing, not even the truth. And the part that cut the deepest? I still missed him. You can spend years keeping someone alive, believing you're fighting for something real. And then, in a single moment, you realize they were planning a future without you all along. That's what stunned me. Not just the betrayal, but the clarity of it. Like the world had been blurry for years, and suddenly, I could see every cruel detail in perfect focus. A few days later, I found myself digging through boxes of old documents, not because I had a plan, but because I needed something to anchor me. The house felt like a stranger's home, and I needed proof that I had lived here, that I mattered here. I opened the filing cabinet in the office, the one Martin always kept locked but never changed the key for. Bank statements, old insurance forms, folders yellowed at the edges. Then, buried beneath the weight of years, I found it, a trust agreement with my name on it. I remembered that document, vaguely. We had set it up before Martin got sick, back when we still talked about retirement and what we'd do with the spare bedroom. I never paid much attention to the details. I trusted him. But this time, something told me to read every word. And there it was, in tidy legal language. A clause naming me, Helena Collins, as the trustee, with the authority to veto any change in distribution, unless amended and notarized. My hands began to shake. He never filed the amendment. He never changed the clause. He'd rewritten his will to cut me out, yes. But he had forgotten about this. The woman he betrayed, the wife he discarded, still held the pen he thought he'd taken away. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than grief or humiliation. I felt power, quiet, unexpected, like a switch had finally been flipped. I read that clause over and over again, almost afraid it would vanish if I blinked too long. The language was airtight, his signature, my name, the date. No loopholes, no backdoors. I couldn't believe it. After everything, after the betrayal, the funeral, the will, This single oversight had cracked the whole thing open. Martin had tried to cut me out with a stroke of a pen, but he forgot I was the one who signed it first. It was like breathing for the first time in weeks. My heart pounded not from grief, but from clarity. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't invisible. I still had a say, and not just in theory, legally, factually, undeniably. That trust agreement gave me control over every asset he tried to hand to someone else. I could feel the weight of the humiliation begin to shift, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. I sat there in the office, papers spread around me like puzzle pieces, and felt a strange sense of poetic justice settle in. All those years I spent making his life easier, and now, without knowing it, he had given me the means to make mine whole again. He had erased me from the will, but he forgot to erase me from the foundation. I didn't rush to act. I let the knowledge settle in me like warm tea on a cold day. For the first time since the funeral, I slept through the night. No tossing, no tears, just rest. I was no longer clinging to broken promises. I had something solid now, a document, a signature. Proof that I was never as powerless as they wanted me to feel. And the best part? Claudia didn't know, not yet. I imagined her somewhere, already celebrating, maybe flipping through real estate listings or sipping wine she didn't pay for, thinking she had won. Let her think it a little longer. Let her revel in her illusion of victory. Because soon enough she'd learn the truth, that the woman she thought was weak, the one she dismissed as a footnote, was still the gatekeeper. Still holding the keys. He thought he could write me out of his story. But he forgot one critical detail. I still had the ink. I still had the power to decide how this story ends. And I wasn't going to waste a single word. The next morning, I walked into the estate attorney's office with the trust agreement folded neatly in my bag. Not as a widow clinging to scraps, but as a woman reclaiming what was hers. The receptionist greeted me with a kind smile, unaware that I was about to change everything. I handed over the document and waited as the attorney read it, her eyes scanning the page with growing interest. When she looked up, she didn't say maybe or let's check. She said, "You have every legal right to override the will." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just nodded and said, "Then let's do it." A few signatures later, the transfer of assets was frozen. Claudia's name, so smugly typed into the will, now meant nothing without my consent. I felt something shift deep inside me, like a steel rod rising in my spine. I wasn't erasing her out of vengeance. I was restoring balance, restoring myself. It didn't take long for Claudia to find out. She called me, of course. I didn't answer. Then came the messages. Desperate, then angry, then demanding. It's mine. He wanted me to have it. I read every word in silence, then typed back a single line. "You took my husband. You don't get to take my life too." And with that, I blocked her number. I didn't scream or lash out. That wasn't my style. Never had been. But there's a kind of fury that doesn't need volume. It sits still in your chest, calm and deliberate, and moves like a tide no one sees coming. That's the energy I carried with me as I reviewed the portfolio, properties, accounts, assets he'd meant to hand to her. I took each one in my hands, examined its worth, and made decisions he never imagined I'd be the one making. There was a beach house I'd never seen, a condo in his name across town, stocks in companies I didn't even know he followed. I sold them all, not out of spite, but strategy. With the proceeds, I made donations in his name, not to honor him, but to write a legacy that felt true. Women's shelters, cancer care, organizations that helped people rebuild after betrayal, loss, and abandonment. His name would live on, but in service of everything he failed to protect. People talk about revenge like it's fire, but I've learned it can be ice, cool, steady, patient. It doesn't have to scream to be sharp. It doesn't have to destroy to be felt. I wasn't burning his memory down. I was carving my own story from its wreckage. And I was just getting started. There was something deeply satisfying about doing everything on my terms. No more waiting, no more asking. I canceled the magazine subscriptions that still came in his name. I cleaned out his closet and donated every last tailored shirt he never wore for me. I redecorated the house, not with rage, but with intention. I hung paintings I loved. I played music he used to call noise. I breathed life into every corner he had hollowed out. One morning, I stood at the mailbox holding a letter addressed to the estate of Martin Collins, and for the first time, it didn't sting. It didn't feel like a cruel joke or a final insult. It felt like closure. I wasn't part of his legacy anymore. I had built my own, stronger, sharper, mine. He had tried to silence me with a document. I answered with action. He left me out of the will, yes, but I didn't fight to be written back in. I rewrote the ending altogether, one where I wasn't the footnote but the author. And the most poetic part? His name would live on exactly how I decided, not for what he took from me, but for what I chose to become in spite of him. I never took it to court, never sat down for a single interview or leaked a scandalous story to the press. I didn't need to. The power wasn't in the headlines, it was in the silence, in knowing I had won without raising my voice. There's a kind of peace that comes from not needing to prove anything. Let them talk. Let her rage. I had nothing to defend. My life was no longer built around someone else's damage. I moved to the coast, a quiet little town where no one knew my name, and no one cared who Martin Collins had been. I bought a small home that faced the sea. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of waves instead of beeping machines or passive-aggressive silence. I'd make coffee, stand barefoot on the porch, and breathe. Not because I was trying to heal anymore, but because I finally had room to live. Volunteering came naturally. I found a women's center nearby, started helping with grant writing and mentoring. I didn't share my story, not at first. I didn't need to. The women who came through the door knew. They recognized the quiet in my eyes, the way I listened without flinching. We didn't bond over what we'd lost. We bonded over what we were learning to rebuild. Then came the lawsuit. Of course it did. Claudia couldn't let it go. She sued, claiming the will reflected Martin's true intentions. She tried to paint herself as the victim, the rightful heir, the grieving partner. I watched the chaos unfold from a distance, sipping tea on my porch while the world she thought she inherited slipped through her fingers. The clause held. The trust was airtight. And her case? It crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. She lost, publicly, quietly, completely. The judge ruled in my favor without so much as a dramatic pause. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a final, elegant punctuation mark on a story she had no right to rewrite. She had walked into a game thinking she knew the rules, but she never realized I helped write them. Not out of malice, out of memory, because I had been there from the beginning. I didn't celebrate with champagne or post some cryptic quote online. Instead, I wrote her a note. No threats, no bitterness, just one line, handwritten in my calmest script. You were his choice. I was his consequence. I mailed it without a return address, and for the first time in a long while, I felt light, like I'd exhaled the last breath I'd been holding. I don't think about Martin much anymore, not with anger, not even with sadness. He became a chapter, not the whole book. Sometimes, when I walk along the shore and the breeze catches my hair just right, I remember the girl I used to be, the one who loved too quietly, who waited too long, who gave everything without asking for much in return. I smile at her now, not with pity, but with pride. She survived, and then she rose. People ask if I ever loved again. I always answer the same way. I fell back in love with myself, with my space, my time, my voice. I discovered that peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of purpose. And mine? It was never tied to a man, a marriage, or a legacy someone tried to steal. It was always mine, waiting for me to come home to it. Martin gave his heart to another woman, but without realizing it, he handed his power to the one he underestimated most. Me. The woman who stayed, who sacrificed, who loved, and who, in the end, rewrote the story not for revenge, but for freedom.